Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. Thanks for joining today's webinar on work-based learning in the states. Just so you know, this webinar is being recorded and slides will be emailed out to everyone who signed up later on. I'm Rachel Hirsch, and I'm National Skills Coalition State Network Director. On the NSC side, I'm also joined by my colleague, Katie Spiker, Senior Federal Policy Analyst, who'll be giving us an update on the federal side of work-based learning and apprenticeship later on in the webinar. We're also so happy to be joined today by Pat Steele, the Site Director for Central Iowa Works, which is a workforce intermediary in Iowa, and Ann Kilzer, who is the Director of the Minnesota Workforce Council Association. Briefly, I'll go over the agenda for today's webinar. As the title suggests, today's webinar will focus primarily on work-based learning in the states. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of how NSC defines work-based learning and recommendations from our toolkit on concrete policy steps states can take to expand or strengthen work-based learning, especially to low-income communities and those that have traditionally been left out of these training opportunities. After that, we're going to spend the bulk of our time talking with our two great panelists today about how their states are supporting work-based learning and apprenticeship. Then, as I mentioned, Katie Spiker will be sharing a federal policy overview and update with us. Finally, I'll close out by talking a bit about our Work-Based Learning Academy that will be launching in May. So to start us out, I thought it would be useful to do a brief overview of what we mean by work-based learning and the recommendations we have for states coming from our toolkit. So first, what do we mean by work-based learning? Work-based learning is a broad term that includes different strategies, such as apprenticeship and career and technical education, that includes learning at a work site. While there's not one universal definition, National Skills Coalition focuses on work-based learning that combines instruction at a worksite during paid employment with classroom education, and that culminates in an industry-recognized credential. The goal is to result in long-term employment for adults. This dual model of training has a long history of proven effectiveness for workers and employers. What makes work-based learning effective? So paid work-based learning is good for businesses and workers. Businesses get a productive employee and can align training with the specific needs of their occupation and industry. Work-based learning leads to increased employee retention and lower turnover costs. On the worker side, workers in these programs obtain skills and credentials while also earning a wage. This is especially important for disadvantaged individuals with pressing financial needs and obligations. Ideally, work-based learning should also include an increase in hourly wages during the course of the program, so that increased skills are rewarded with a corresponding increase in pay. Work-based learning and apprenticeship is of increasing interest today because of several factors. First, the economy is doing well and unemployment is low, so employers are seeking new ways to establish a pipeline of skilled workers to fulfill their human capital needs. Second, there's been an increasing amount of attention paid to apprenticeship at the federal level. President Trump has verbally expressed support for expanding apprenticeships and work-based learning. And during the Obama administration, several grants were given out to the states from the Department of Labor to support the expansion of registered apprenticeship programs. Additionally, the National Governors Association has started its second iteration of its Policy Academy on Scaling Work-Based Learning that supports several states in scaling work-based learning, specifically in STEM fields. So there's clearly momentum and attention being paid to this area. However, current state work-based learning policies do not usually focus on low-skilled populations such as out-of-school youth or disadvantaged adults, so there's much room for growth in this area. Our toolkit focuses on several policies that states can implement to target low-income out-of-school youth and adults. And now I'm going to briefly go over each of these recommendations. Our first recommendation is to create state grant programs to fund work-based learning intermediaries or explore opportunities to modify existing state sector partnership grant programs to help these sector partnerships become work-based learning intermediaries. These third-party local intermediaries can serve an important role in expanding apprenticeship by handling administrative duties for employers, such as helping them through the often arduous and sometimes intimidating process of becoming a registered apprenticeship program. Intermediaries also sometimes serve as the employer of record for out-of-school youth and help recruit participants. They can also provide pre-apprenticeship training for interested people who may not yet be ready for skilled employment. In many states, these organizations are already supporting successful work-based learning programs, but aren't receiving any funding from their states to do so. NSC recommends that states provide both planning and implementation grants to support intermediaries in this role. We'll hear more about this from Pat Steele later in the webinar since he works for a workforce intermediary. Next, states can establish a support fund to provide support services such as case management, childcare, transportation, and other assistance to low-income or underserved communities to prepare for and succeed in work-based learning. Even though work-based learning and apprenticeship includes pay while workers are learning, many low-income people still need additional help in order to succeed in and complete a training program. This is especially true if they have children they need to be taken care of during their training or are facing other barriers such as difficulty affording or finding transportation to and from a work or learning site. These support services can be delivered in tandem with pre-employment training and work-based learning, which helps ensure that individuals will be successful once entering the training program or during the actual training or apprenticeship program itself. Next, states can create state-level financial incentives to help employers establish new apprenticeship programs and hire apprentices from low-income or underserved communities. This includes state-level tax credits for employers employing apprentices, as well as enhanced credit for employing apprentices from disadvantaged populations. Intermediaries can often also help employers with paperwork to receive these tax credits, making the process even easier. Another financial incentive would be grants to small employers to assist with the cost of starting and managing new apprenticeships. The time and administrative process needed to start up an apprenticeship program can be daunting to any employer, but especially small businesses with less resources. Grants to small employers can help subsidize this cost and make getting an apprenticeship program up and running more doable. Our most recent state scan revealed that 18 states provide either a grant or a tax credit to employers who participate in work-based learning. Ideally, states would provide both. Minnesota's pipeline grants are an example of this, and Anne will be talking more about this in the coming panel discussion. Finally, much of the classroom learning portion of the dual training model takes place at community or technical colleges. So another recommendation is to institute tuition waivers for apprentices post-secondary classroom instruction and a requirement that such instruction articulate with certificates and degrees. To avoid the lost earnings and tuition money that the institutions could incur, NSC recommends coupling tuition waivers with grants to institutions. Tuition waivers can make this partnership more affordable to all involved. This is especially important during an apprentice's first year when they may struggle to get on a firm financial footing. Now, obviously, these are high-level overviews of the policy recommendations, but you can go online and find the toolkit to delve more into them or contact me to discuss more if you'd like. Also, if you're interested in advancing these policies in your state, you might want to consider whether applying to our Work-Based Learning Academy is a good idea. And again, I'll be speaking a little bit about that more at the end of the webinar. Now let's move on to our panel discussion where we can hear about 2 state examples of implementation of some of these recommendations. As I mentioned before, we have Pat Steele from Central Iowa Works and Ann Kilzer from the Minnesota Workforce Council Association with us today. I'm going to start by asking them a few questions and we'll have plenty of time for audience Q&A after that. So Pat and Ann, first, thanks so much for joining us today. To start our conversation, I'm going to ask you both to tell us a bit about how the workforce landscape in your state currently supports apprenticeship and work-based learning. Pat, we can start with you. Specifically, can you also talk about Central Iowa Works' role in this landscape as an intermediary and what state policies support your role as an intermediary?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, I guess, depending on where you might be. In terms of Iowa, I think, Rachel, some of the points you talked on, like many states, we're experiencing a workforce shortage here. We have approximately 16% of our workforce are 55 and older, and they will be retiring over the next several years, and so we just simply don't have enough workers to replace them. So I think the workforce landscape here is that we just need more skilled workers. Iowa has a goal to have 70% of its workforce with some post-secondary education training by 2025, and we're around 55% now. So this workforce landscape, really calls for us to increase the skills. And probably the other thing that's driving things here in Iowa is the amount of student debt. And apprenticeships and work-based learning are a way to avoid that or alleviate that, because obviously when you go in an apprenticeship or work-based learning, you're generally not accruing debt and you're getting paid while you work. And it's particularly critical for disadvantaged populations who maybe can't afford either the tuition or the time that they need work immediately. So this work-based learning apprenticeships work well for that population because they go to work, get training, and getting paid while they do it. Our role in particular has been to market work-based learning to employers. There has been some reluctance among some employers to engage in apprenticeship because some perceive it's a union kind of thing, and yet about 48% of the registered apprentices in Iowa are non-union. And we're not taking a stand whether for union, against union. We just want people to have the facts. So one of the things we had to do is to do some marketing to talk to employers about apprenticeships and work-based learning and how they can be an advantage. I think another role that we've assumed is putting together groups of employers from like industry to bring them together to look at work-based learning. We're currently working with a couple healthcare employers now who are trying to develop a certified medical assistant apprenticeship program. We hope to have that ready to go this fall. Third role for us is we really act as kind of a screening or assessment for people. We have some tools in place. We're able to do that, and that serves a real resource for employers. And then we also, Rachel, as you mentioned, the supportive services, we either can provide those or broker those: case management, job coaching, childcare, transportation, and so on, to really help participants get the supports they need to get into a work-based learning or apprenticeship program. So those are kind of the roles that we're playing here in Iowa.
Awesome. Thanks, Pat. And same question to you, just giving us a little bit about the current landscape, and also if you wanted to touch on how this might have changed or evolved under WIOA, and tell us a little bit about the pipeline grants.
Sure. So this is Ann Kilzer. I'm the director of the Workforce Counsel Association, and that is the association in Minnesota of our 16 workforce development boards, as well as the Title IB adult dislocated worker and youth programs. In Minnesota, we're also one of the states where Health and Human Services is delivered at the county level. So employment and training programs under TANF are also integrated very closely into our workforce centers. So that helps. So under WIOA, there's a lot of focus on both career pathways, sector strategies, and also integration across state agencies. And so in many ways, Minnesota was a bit ahead of the curve on that, just because of our integration so closely with not only TANF, but also adult basic education and higher ed through some of the career pathway programs that we had started about 10 years ago. A lot of those partnerships honestly start at the local level, and those partnerships create best practices, and then the state agencies kind of start to align as a result, and have been cognizant of trying to make policy changes so that we can align programs across funding streams and across state agencies. So that's been an advantage, certainly, and just has grown as a result of WIOA encouraging some of those things and putting some specific language and parameters and support around those ideas that we had already been doing in Minnesota. We also had one of the DOL apprenticeship grants that was funded under the previous administration that is still underway here. So that was seed money in some ways to support the efforts that we're currently working on. We in Minnesota also have a workforce development fund, which is a fund that is specific fee that employers pay that goes into a separate fund, separate from the general fund, to support employment and training programs generally. So that was a source of state funding that's actually supporting now our pipeline project. We have great labor market information analysts at our state agencies and really active employers, both on the workforce boards, and then Minnesota being a place with a lot of Fortune 500 companies, but also a place that currently has really low unemployment rates. Employers are really engaged in how do we grow our workforce from within and make sure that everyone who is able to work is working and has the skills that they need to meet those employer needs. So all that, along with the fact that several years ago our legislature combined committees so that the higher education committee got turned into higher education and workforce development. And part of the impetus for that was in Minnesota, only about 18% of high school students went to college and graduated from college and were employed by the second year after college graduation. So there was a real acknowledgement that a lot of the folks that we need to be engaging in training to meet our employer needs are not, traditional students going straight from high school to college, but how do we also catch those adults who maybe need short-term training or credentials or skills to meet employer needs. And then we had some legislators at the state legislature who kind of made this pipeline project their mission. So all of those things kind of stars aligned. So the pipeline project specifically in Minnesota is a private investment, public education, labor, and industry experience. Many times at the legislature, as we all know, both at the federal level and the state level, people kind of try to create acronyms that are catchy. And so it's a long title, but basically it serves as a catalyst for developing industry-based, employer-driven dual training programs throughout the state. So the project targets 4 high-growth industry sectors that typically had more limited experience in utilizing workplace learning or apprenticeship. So advanced manufacturing, but also agriculture, healthcare services, and IT. So the dual training approach, like apprenticeship, is an earn-as-you-learn approach, like Pat was talking about, where the employers invest in employees by building a training infrastructure and developing their career pathways. So it's industry-based, it's employer-driven, and it does have that dual training experience, again, kind of like Pat was mentioning. So the dual training grants, this addresses one of the issues that was mentioned earlier about employers being able to access and overcome some of those barriers to creating programs. The grants themselves cover the cost of training. It's a maximum grant of $150,000 per employer or $6,000 per student. Large employers are required to pay a 25% match. And the students must apply for FAFSA if they attend one of the eligible institutions. So any employer can apply if the employees will be trained in an eligible occupation, if the employees have not yet attained competency standards within that occupation. The positions, because it's a state-funded program, the positions that our folks are training for have to be located in the state of Minnesota. And then there's some more specific details within the application of the competencies that have to be met through the related instruction and on-the-job training. So we're matching our state college and university campuses with employers. Employers are determining what the competencies are, and then our state colleges are responding by creating the curriculum for those employers.
Awesome. Thanks, Anne. That's some great background information. So moving on a little more specifically, delving into the legislation, and Anne, you touched on this a bit already, the impetus for establishing and expanding apprenticeship opportunities in your state. Pat, maybe you could start off by telling us a bit about the Iowa Apprenticeship Act and Future Ready Iowa and how those support your work and any advocacy you were involved in getting those passed.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Yeah, in 2014, the Iowa legislature enacted the Iowa Apprenticeship Act, and basically its purpose was to increase the number of registered apprenticeships in the state. The Iowa Economic Development Authority, kind of our economic development arm of the state government, is responsible for administering it. Only organizations that are going to use registered apprenticeships are eligible for this training fund. It's about $3 million total, is a standing appropriation of about $3 million. And employers can be a sponsor, unions, there's just a number of entities that can qualify, but generally you're looking for a group of employers to kind of come together, or trades to come together and apply. And then there's a deadline each year when they have to apply, and then the training funds are really to support apprenticeships. I think the other nice part of this is that the Iowa Workforce Development, our public workforce system, provides technical assistance and support for organizations wanting to start a registered apprenticeship program. So sometimes people might be scared off with apprenticeships because they think there's going to be a lot of paperwork involved, a lot of time, et cetera. But the Iowa Workforce Development is able to assign someone to help entities with that, and that really kind of cuts down on the bureaucratic issues that some might be reluctant to do. In terms of why Iowa was looking at this, I think kind of like in Ann's situation, you had some legislators that kind of made this a project that they really wanted to have the pipeline to get going. And I think the same thing happened in Iowa, is that we had some government officials travel to Europe and Germany in particular, and they saw the utilization of apprenticeships there and thought this is something we need to do back here in Iowa. We are trying to keep our advanced manufacturing sector viable, and so I think that's really drove it, was the kind of what we saw being done in Europe, and that seemed to be a good model. And I think the other thing is that sometimes I think with training entities, community colleges, employers have gotten a little separated from training with the workforce. And I think the apprenticeship and work-based learning kind of closes that circle a little bit and get employers much more involved in developing, designing training programs, overseeing those, because they can tailor it to what they need in their particular industry or as particular employer. So I think those were the impetus, seeing what we saw in Germany, and then trying to get employers much more engaged in workforce development than perhaps they had been in the past.
And Future Ready Iowa is your state's attainment goal, is that right?
Future Ready Iowa is our workforce effort here in the state. And as I mentioned earlier, the goal is to have 70% of Iowans with post-secondary education by 2025. So there's a lot of ways to do that. Certainly short-term certificate programs, community colleges, 4-year degrees, but apprenticeship and work-based learning is something we have not utilized to the extent we should. And I think that's why it's kind of risen as a real emphasis and a priority for the state.
Gotcha. Thanks, Pat. And Ann, again, you spoke a little bit about the impetus for establishing the pipeline grants, but also if you could talk a bit more about that. And I know that Minnesota has placed an emphasis on equity. So if you could touch on how the state sees apprenticeship and work-based learning as helping to advance equity, that would be really interesting.
Sure. So Minnesota actually has a relatively long history of doing work-based learning as a way to engage people and address both employer needs as well as job seekers' needs. So all the way back in the 1980s, during the recession, there was an emergency employment development program, and that was really the state providing subsidized wages for folks who were out of work. We had a lot of workers laid off, particularly in greater Minnesota around the mining industry and other types of industries that were affected by the economy at that time. And so that was a really successful wage subsidy program. And ever since then, we've kind of taken the learnings of why being able to earn while you learn is beneficial, not only both to employers, but to job seekers for many of the reasons that we already outlined. So since then, as I mentioned, we have integrated our TANF program. So we've on and off throughout the past decade or two through our Health and Human Services agencies have provided supported work opportunities for folks who are low income on public assistance programs. We have the senior employment programs and the Minnesota Youth Program, which is very similar to the federal youth programs funded under WIOA, but also our state is providing funding for youth experience, which has been particularly helpful. As kind of a side note, once WIOA put the emphasis on older youth, we still have those state funds where we can continue to work with in-school youth and younger youth to provide those types of experiences. So again, Minnesota has always put an emphasis on kind of this idea. Most of those initiatives, however, were primarily utilized in the public sector, where public sector jobs were the ones being either the employers of record or willing to place participants. So this newer program, the Pipeline Project, is really, I don't want to say the first time that we've had private sector more engaged, but typically, or definitely where the emphasis is primarily on the private sector rather than public sector. And as you mentioned, equity is a huge issue in Minnesota. So in Minnesota, we actually have one of the highest largest gaps between people of color attaining education and employment as opposed to people, Caucasians or other populations. So a real focus on closing that gap. So again, because of some of the reasons that Pat mentioned, for low-wage, low-income individuals, being able to access wages while they're gaining credentials and other types of educational opportunities or apprenticeships has been a way to really focus allowing people to close that equity gap while engaging employers. Another issue in Minnesota is with some of our WIOA programs, it's not so much that people aren't able to attain a job, it's their retention once they're on the job. So the idea that employers have the opportunity to really engage their apprentices or people who are receiving subsidized wages, oftentimes they have a higher retention rate long term than folks who are doing other types of placements. So that idea that employers really have the opportunity to kind of try people out, make sure that they have the soft skills that they need, has really been helpful. And then with our low-wage, low-income populations, another benefit is that we've been able to utilize resources from other programs for some of those support services that are so important for both attainment and retention of employment for participants. So because Minnesota has such a low unemployment rate, we're finding that the folks who currently aren't working are people who have a lot of barriers to employment. So the fact that we can utilize those, some of those other funds is really important as well.
Thanks, Anne. That's really interesting. And Anne, I'll keep with you on this one. So we've touched a bit on some challenges, but if you could talk a little bit more about the biggest challenges you've either heard of or encountered in the area of work-based learning and apprenticeship for workers, employers, or both.
So I think Pat touched on some of these, but just the awareness of the opportunity, trying to gain the attention of employers who are busy, you know, running their businesses, particularly smaller businesses, is always a challenge. And having people being willing to come to the table and kind of collaborate with folks who might otherwise be competitors is sometimes a hurdle that needs to be overcome. The complexity, whether it's perceived or real, about the amount of work or time that it would take to get something up and running is a concern, as well as some of the union concerns that were mentioned before. I think people don't realize that it can be, that it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of program, that there are lots of ways that you can implement these types of programs, and that we can be flexible and help address specific employer needs. I think too is just the employer's time that it takes to be a truly sector-led, industry-led program. Just as an example, for the pipeline project, there are over 350 private sector industry leaders that are engaged in the different panels for the different industries, whereas there are 64 employers that are actually receiving the assistance from grants. So the amount of upfront time that it takes from employers to kind of relay what types of training they need, what kind of credentials or experience they're looking for from job seekers or from participants is really, that's kind of where a lot of the work starts. But for the folks who are actually taking advantage of the grants and advantage and being able to capitalize on all that upfront work, it really is a pretty smooth process. But I think just the amount of time that it takes to get it up and running and the dedication from the employers or who are involved is definitely can be kind of a heavy lift if they don't see the value in it. So also being able to really articulate what's in it for employers has been very important.
For sure, I've heard that a lot, and that's another reason why intermediaries can play such an important role in helping take some of the burden off the employers. Pat, I would give you the same question. You touched a little bit on the union issue, but either delving a bit more into that or any other challenges.
Yeah, I think so. And when I was on a school board here in Iowa, sometimes we're called recovering school board members. But anyway, one of the challenges we always had is I think we, as a country, always marketed to parents and students that the only way to success in this country was a 4-year college degree. And certainly that's a pathway for many, but it's not the only one. And I remember being on the school board, we talk about the role of apprenticeships and what we could do to encourage students to look at vocational, that not everyone needed to or wanted to go or was not best for them for 4-year college. So I think what we're trying to do now in Iowa is do a little bit of that marketing to parents, guidance counselors, teachers, and students in particular, to let them know that apprenticeships are a great way. You can avoid a lot of college debt. You can get paid while you're learning. Wages are excellent in most of these occupations, and they're really necessary work, and they really can't be exported to other countries to do the work that plumbers and electricians and carpenters, construction workers, laborers can all be here, and the same with healthcare workers as well. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges is trying to turn our educational system around a little bit to recognize that there are other ways to get skills and education besides kind of the 4-year college path. I think probably the other thing is one of the things that plagues many industries is turnover of workers. And so one of the things we try to talk to employers about why they might want to consider apprenticeships is I think I read this correctly, but about 90% of people who complete a registered apprenticeship program remain employed with that company. So it's a great way for employers to build loyalty. I think if workers see that companies are investing in them, they tend to want to be loyal to that employer because of what they've done along the way to help them acquire the skills that they need. So I think talking to employers about retention rates and loyalty, and it's kind of a two-way street. I think that's another area that we probably need to talk more about than we have in the past. And I think Ann touched on a lot of the other things as well. So those would just be a couple of the points that I would make regarding apprenticeships and work-based learning.
Awesome. And last moderated question from me. So as I went over earlier in the webinar, our toolkit lists a number of policies that states can take up to expand apprenticeship. Obviously, your states are already doing some of this. What else of them would really help address some of the challenges you've named, and how? And other ideas as well, welcome. Ann, we'll go with you first.
Yep, so I think as much as I've talked about access for currently low wage, low income individuals, there still is a gap between some of the folks who aren't working who would like to engage in the process, particularly working with our adult basic education folks for people who are to a point where they can't even access the training or kind of bridge programs that we have available to get up to the point where they're ready for an apprenticeship and have the basic skills levels that are needed for work-based learning opportunities. So being more mindful of how, now that we have the pipeline project in place, how we continue to reach down and provide support services to those who need additional skills or soft skills or supports just to be able to access the actual opportunity that pipeline gives grants to folks. And then I think another issue is always sustainability, of course, both with federal funding and state funding. So many projects are funded by either competitive grants or one-time funding types of things, or the affinity that everyone has for pilot projects. Once we have something that's up and running and is successful and kind of becomes systematic, sometimes folks lose interest a little bit and are chasing kind of the new shiny model or want to try something different. So just that whole sustainability effort is always an issue. Again, in Minnesota, we're lucky that we do have a workforce development fund that is specifically targeted for these types of efforts, but it's certainly not guaranteed funding by any means. For each biennial budget, we have to go back and ensure that the resources are in place. So that's always a challenge as well. I think that people in this current economy see this as a valuable tool to ensure that people have access to workers. And I think really having employers on board can be a key in many ways for advocacy for these types of efforts. But again, just creating that momentum and sustainability is always an issue, whether it's for this or any of the other programs that we're delivering in regard to employment and training.
Absolutely. Pat, what about for you in Iowa?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think Ann touched on some of the significant ones, so I won't be repetitive. But I think what would help here in Iowa, if we could, in any state, I think, is if there's a grant program to really help fund intermediaries like ourselves, Central Iowa Works. We're fortunate that our United Way provides that funding, but not all United Ways can do that. So I think if we had some kind of a state program to provide funding for these third parties or work-based learning intermediaries would help. I don't think we in Iowa has done a good job as what Ann's articulated in Minnesota regarding disadvantaged populations. So I think we need some kind of a funding mechanism to help these individuals to be prepared for kind of the work-based learning or apprenticeships. Another area I think this is mentioned in the toolkit, is small employers needing some financial assistance. Sometimes large employers have the wherewithal and the financial advantages to be able to look at apprenticeships, but that's not always possible for smaller employers. So I think that's a big one. Another one would be pre-apprenticeship programs. Again, it's kind of part of that preparation they need in order to be accepted into apprenticeship. And I think some kind of a tax credit for employers to, if they are training or providing apprenticeship opportunities for disadvantaged populations, would be very welcome. And I would just kind of close with, I think there's one population that we across this country have really struggled to reduce their unemployment rate, and that's individuals with disabilities. And I think apprenticeship or work-based learning may be a terrific solution for that population, particularly those with learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities who might struggle learning in a classroom setting, but could learn by doing. And I think that's one of the things we're going to look at here in Iowa, is to see if that unemployment rate for people with disabilities can be lowered by looking at apprenticeship and work-based learning. I think that holds great promise, and that's a population I think we really probably need to spend a little more time with this approach.
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up, Pat. Yeah, so I heard a lot of common themes about, making sure we engage employers, and also the importance of having the ability to take any of the load off of the employers as possible, because it can be definitely a barrier to entry for them, if all the paperwork and the startup costs, et cetera. And also a lot about pre-apprenticeship programs and making sure we support apprentices who are coming in with lots of barriers and might need extra assistance to get ready for the apprenticeship program, and also to succeed in the apprenticeship program once they're in it. So thanks again, Pat and Ann. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience now, so you can submit your question using the question button. I've already gotten a few, but please keep submitting. And I'm going to start out with, we got a question, and Ann and Pat, I think you both touched on this a little bit, about the process for initial assessment for candidates who are looking to join work-based learning and apprenticeship programs. So Pat, especially, do you want to talk a little bit about that, and how you assess if someone's ready for the apprenticeship program, or where they might need some pre-apprenticeship training?
Yeah, it really depends on the industry and kind of the skill level, reading level, and all that you have to do. So we're working on that right now. We're trying to launch, as I mentioned earlier, a certified medical assistant apprenticeship program. And that's one of the ones that we're grappling with, is that, what are the skills that are needed for that particular position? As I said, kind of reading, literacy levels are important. So I think that's one that we're probably not as far along as we should be, in all honesty.
And Ann, did you want to touch on that at all, or?
sorry, it took me to second to unmute. I think Pat hit most of the things. Yep, Pat hit kind of the same types of activities that we in Minnesota do as well in regard to ensuring that folks are prepared to take advantage of the opportunity. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And then we got a question again about marketing, which I think you both touched on, this issue of we have to, have people realize that a 4-year degree isn't necessarily the path that everyone needs to take. Pat, do you have any specifics or go into a little more detail about how you guys are marketing these programs in the communities, especially to parents?
Yeah, we've actually been working particularly with advanced manufacturing and our trades, the construction trades on that, and try to do kind of job fairs in high schools, try to work with guidance counselors during the summer to expose them to work, give them an opportunity to go into some different jobs over the summer, and teachers as well, so they can see what these kinds of jobs are, and they're just better educated, I think, in order to be able to talk to their students about that. So that's a couple things that we're doing here, trying to work with schools. And then I think going to events at schools for parents when you have an opportunity to talk to them and have them look at the wages and debt and et cetera. So I think those are a couple of things that we've been trying to do in marketing. In terms of with employers, I think the biggest concern they have is, again, I talked a little bit about the paperwork and then the cost of training, and I think we just have to kind of show them some facts on what that involves, and again, provide some of the technical assistance to relieve them with some of the paperwork.
For sure. Just reading over these.
One thing I would add is some of our local workforce development boards have gotten really creative. So Minnesota actually has one of the highest student to counselor ratios in the nation. So we have like 700 students on average for every counselor. So we've actually received state funding as well for our career counselors from the workforce centers to actually go into schools and partner with them. And so that's been a great way to do it. A lot of the things that Pat mentioned about marketing to parents. One particularly creative one was one of our workforce boards was actually putting labor market information and opportunities available in the high school football programs. You know how you can buy paid ads in the programs? And so their parents apparently like sitting in the stands talking about the information that was in there for career opportunities for kids. So just, again, trying to get the information in front of parents as well as students. And then our state agency staff has been really proactive about marketing to businesses, providing webinars, and actually going out to employer groups and industry councils and things like that. Really, it just takes, that one-on-one interaction, and having state staff who are willing to do that on a statewide basis in partnership with our local workforce center staff and partners has been really key for this. And there is some funding provided through the grants for that kind of administrative marketing aspects of it, which has been very helpful. A lot of times that's not necessarily an allowable activity for public funding, so that's certainly been helpful.
Great, thanks. I just also want to reiterate that the slides will be available after the presentation, and they'll be emailed out to everyone who's registered, so you don't have to worry about that. So got a question about hiring rates once the work-based learning or apprenticeship program is complete. Do either of you want to talk a little bit about what you know about that? Katie Spiker, who's our federal policy analyst, feel free to weigh in here as well.
Ann, do you want? I can talk, Ann, unless you want to. If you want to go ahead.
Well, nope, go ahead, Pat. I think you had cited some specific stats earlier, so if you have more information about that, that would be great.
Well, in terms with typically with an apprenticeship, I mean, you're hired and then you go through training. So the only reason people wouldn't be employed at the end would be is that they just didn't satisfy the program requirements. Either they weren't learning the skills or weren't attending, or there was some kind of a problem. So generally in apprenticeship or work-based learning, they're hired and then the training begins. So I I think in terms of length of time of apprenticeships, they can range anywhere from a year to 5 years, kind of depends on what field you're going into. But generally, I think you're typically hired, and only if you're not meeting some of the program requirements would be the only reason you wouldn't end up with a job when you complete your apprenticeship.
Right. Also got another question asking for more information on intermediaries and how they're funded, et cetera. And obviously that varies widely by state and region and locality. But Pat, could you maybe talk a little bit more about generally Central Iowa Works' role as an intermediary and the funding streams?
Yeah, primarily our funding comes through United Way, which has funded us for the last 5 to 8 years. Sometimes intermediaries can be a part of a community college system. Some states actually have a direct appropriation from the legislature to fund intermediaries. We also seek grants from both foundations as well as federal state grants to add to some more funding other than just United Way. So I think it's kind of a combination. I think you typically want the intermediary to be kind of a neutral partner, not necessarily providing training because that can put them in competition with community colleges and others, but they're really kind of a neutral and just trying to bring employers together to discuss, kind of the workforce needs, and then working with job seekers to help them get the training that they need. So generally the funding comes from either foundations, United Ways, and sometimes there's publicly funded in some states.
Awesome. Well, I think we're going to transition now to our federal policy overview and update. Thanks again, Ann and Pat, for joining us today and helping us learn about what's going on in your states. I'm going to turn it over to Katie Spiker, and also some of your questions I see have more to do with the federal side of things, so she might be able to touch on these in this next section of the presentation. So Katie?
Yes, hello, thank you. So apprenticeship has been a big priority and buzzword in DC. I think really building off of what Rachel and Pat and Ann had said, a lot of the questions that we see policymakers in DC raising are many of the same things that folks across the country are thinking about and trying to address. We also, one of the things that National Skills Coalition has been doing along with a group of other national partners that we're working with through a collaborative we're calling the Apprenticeship Forward Collaborative, is really working to expand the knowledge of policymakers with some of the best practices that are coming out of the states, as well as share information among states. That's a lot of what Rachel and the states team work on their academy is going to be, but really making sure that some of what we see coming out of Iowa and Minnesota is translated back up to DC for ideas and how we can think about apprenticeship and work-based learning on a federal level as well. So kind of with that foundation, unlike some of the conversations happening in DC right now, work-based learning and apprenticeship remains something that has bipartisan support. So we have seen the current administration and White House focusing on expanding apprenticeship in some similarities to the way that we saw the previous administration doing so. And in Congress, there's been bipartisan support for nearly $100 million in appropriated funds for Department of Labor to expand apprenticeship for the past 2 years, and we're expecting similar levels when we get to a final 18 spending package. Along the idea of spending, so last week the president released his budget request for fiscal year 2019. It was a mixed bag for workforce and education programs. It did have steep proposed cuts to Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, with recommended level funding for current technical education, a cut for adult education. The president did ask for an increase to about $200 million in funding to expand apprenticeship. But really what we're seeing there is that kind of disconnect between the idea of the broader workforce system, like what Ann was talking about, is really connected to how we're expanding work-based learning opportunities across the country. And so it's really one of the big things that I think we'll be working on over the next few months is is really messaging to policymakers and making sure that people who are interested in expanding opportunities in work-based learning understand that apprenticeship isn't a separate kind of training strategy, but work-based learning is a broader strategy that should be integrated into the way that we're doing other workforce and education training programs. And we've got, you know, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, when it was reauthorized in 2014, one of the intended purposes was to better align the registered apprenticeship system with the workforce system. And we're seeing lots of great practices bubbling up from across the country in ways that the workforce system is aligning not just with registered apprenticeship, but also with expansion of on-the-job training and incumbent worker training and other types of programs that can really facilitate and expand this access to a broader spectrum of work-based learning opportunities. So the other focus from the administration has been, last summer, the president released the executive order on apprenticeship expansion. It authorized the Department of Labor to issue regulations on this industry-recognized apprenticeship, which would be as proposed, is intended to be a parallel or separate system from our registered apprenticeship system, really intending for a non-governmental authority to be the bearer of the certified standard. So it established executive order established a task force that's tasked with writing a report to the president on how we can expand this type of apprenticeship in the United States. They're having a series of meetings. The task force has kind of varied representation, some labor representation, some folks from industry associations, a few governors, and the idea is that this group is supposed to make these recommendations to the administration about how to create this expanded industry-recognized apprenticeship. The executive order also directed Department of Labor to spend funding on this expansion, but it also then kind of juxtaposing and really reflecting what we saw in the president's budget from this year, also targeted agencies to identify ineffective programs that are ineffective workforce and education programs under their jurisdiction, and propose them for elimination. And so I think, again, this is kind of reiterating that disconnect that we see sometimes in the conversations about what the broader workforce and education system, the importance of supporting those existing programs when we're talking about expanding apprenticeship at the federal level. On transitioning to thinking about what's going on the Hill, Congress, like I said, has shown a lot of interest and bipartisan interest in supporting apprenticeship and work-based learning. In addition to the appropriated funds, there are a number of bipartisan bills. We've been focusing on a few strategies that really complement the work that Rachel described as happening on our state level work. We've got one bill called the Partners Act that we've been working on and championing with Representative Ferguson, who's a Republican from Georgia, and Representative Bonamici, who's a Democrat from Oregon. They introduced this in the House last fall. And it builds on the idea that Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act requires but doesn't fund states and local areas to establish these industry and sector partnerships. And partners would provide funding to these industry-led partnerships to help expand capacity of entities like Pat and Ann to help businesses and industry provide additional work-based learning opportunities. We've also been working on a bill called the Builds Act, which was introduced by Senators Kane and Portman in the House, bipartisan introduction, in the Senate, and was introduced by Senators Mitchell and Tim Ryan in the House. And Builds Act would target any funding under an eventual infrastructure package. The president has proposed $1 trillion of investment in infrastructure over the next 10 years, and according to the Center on Education and Workforce at Georgetown, that could lead to as many as 11 million new jobs in those industries, not even counting the shortages that those industries are already looking for workers. And so Builds Act would ensure that any investment towards infrastructure would also include funding to help support a diverse workforce development. And it would really, again, also complement the work that that Rachel described as working on at the state level to help provide some of these support services, pre-employment training, as well as working with businesses to help them align and work with other partners in their communities to make sure that this holistic expansion is possible. Another thing that I think Rachel mentioned, the state scan of work-based learning policies. Something like 14 states just this year implemented policies with tax credits for apprenticeship and work-based learning. And this idea has also been really popular at the federal level. We have been working on a proposal around expanding the work opportunity tax credit, which, like what Rachel was describing, would provide an additional tax credit to businesses who are not just hiring current targeted populations under that bill, which right now, or that tax credit, which right now is largely some of the welfare recipients and targeted populations, but then for those same populations would provide an additional tax credit to businesses who are then training those workers as well. And so there's a lot happening on the federal level. I'm happy to answer some of the questions that folks submitted or any others, but you can see that a lot of the work that we're focusing on is really stemming out of the best practices that we've heard from our partners across the country. It's working for you all.
Awesome, thank you, Katie. So I am going to briefly talk now about our Work-Based Learning Academy. I'm seeing some questions about that as well. So this academy was announced in response to interest from the field in advancing apprenticeship and work-based learning policy in their states. We announced the call for applications at the beginning of this month. And so specifically, the academy will be focused on helping state coalitions expand apprenticeship and work-based learning to low-income communities. And it's meant to be complementary of other efforts going on, both at the state level and by national organizations that NSC has been working with to advance apprenticeship and work-based learning. So high-level overview, we're seeking teams of 3 to 5 people from different types of organizations in their state who want to advance a policy from our toolkit in their state. So again, those policies that I listed at the beginning of the webinar and that are available in more detail online. So these state coalitions will be guided by a faculty advisor who's an expert in that field. And then there will be several all-academy in-person and virtual meetings to facilitate peer-to-peer learning as well. And the academy will be launching in May of this year and going until June 2019. And applications are due on March 1st of this year. So you can find the application on our website. And I also encourage you, please, if you have any questions that are more specific to an idea you're thinking about or a state-specific question, send me an email, which I'm going to leave up at the end of this webinar, and I'd be more than happy to talk with you one-on-one. And with that, I think that brings this webinar on work-based learning in the states to a close, just at the hour mark. So I want to say thanks again to our great panelists, Ann Kilzer and Pat Steele, for joining us today. And thanks to my colleague, Katie Spiker, for the federal policy overview. If you have further questions or thoughts, make sure to visit our website and sign up for our email list or follow us on social media. And as promised, here is my contact information, which I'll leave up for a few minutes. My email is rachelh@nationalskillscoalition.org. I'm the state network manager, and I'd be happy to talk more about any of the material presented here today or about the academy, or connect you to the right person on our staff to answer your question. So thank you again all so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great afternoon.